Thundarr the Barbarian. This isn't just a sword swinging cartoon hero from the 80s. This is the American subconscious during the late Cold War. A primal scream dressed up in Hanna-Barbera style animation. He embodies raw, masculine energy, fear of collapse, and the yearning for freedom from oppressive systems. But beneath that glowing Sunsword and the Conan-style muscles lies a deeper psychological profile. Now, this is about trauma in a post-apocalyptic mindset. Thundarr exists in a ruined Earth. This is shattered by runaway science and sorcery, so his constant battles against wizards and overlords is less about villains and more about humanity's fear of its own creation. And psychologically, Thundarr carries apocalypse trauma with him. The belief that order has failed and only primal strength and instinct can protect what's left. So he doesn't trust systems, he doesn't negotiate, he cuts through his problems, very literally, with his Sunsword. And that blade is his psyche, a glowing, uncontrollable projection of pure willpower. He has a pack mentality and really values brotherhood. So his companions, Ariel the princess and Ookla the mook, aren't just sidekicks. These are archetypes of a fractured psyche. Now, Ariel, who's all about sorcery knowledge, she represents the rational and intellectual mind, balancing his instincts. Thundarr listens, but he never bows because his mistrust of sorcery mirrors humanity's fear of unchecked science. Now, Ookla, of course, is beast instinct. He's the raw animal side of Thundarr's nature, unrefined but very loyal. And Thundarr keeps him close because he knows his survival depends on that primal fury. And together, this trio forms a whole psyche, instinct, reason, and willpower in constant conflict, but also in balance with each other. And he is just a pure distillation of barbarian fantasy. A man unchained, literally his origin story begins with him breaking free of slavery. And the moment is symbolic. He is rejecting control, authority, and symbolic oppression. His body becomes his only truth, his sword the only justice. So Thundarr is really the id release. But unlike the chaos of the pure id, he imposes his own order through violence. He reflects Americans' obsession with rugged individualism, survivalism, and a distrust of elites during the late 70s and early 80s era. Every villain is a wizard, a warlord, or an overlord, and embodies abusive authority. Thundarr doesn't just fight monsters, he fights the very idea of centralized control. Each battle is a symbolic of the inner psyche tearing down false gods and false science and corrupt rulers. It's the eternal fantasy of rebellion. The lone man has nothing but a sword against a world of hierarchies. And he isn't just muscle and fury, he's a walking archetype of apocalypse psychology, distrust of systems, reliance on primal instinct, need of a chosen family or pack, desire for freedom at all costs. He is the warrior dream of a civilization where fear owns the end. In his yell, Lord of Lights, you hear a man trying to summon meaning behind a broken world. Something we always enjoy, the adventures of Thundarr, but knowing there's a deeper meaning behind him really opens up what those individual cartoons meant back then as well.